Alright, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the road to 18-inch arms. So, per usual, as of late, I'm going to be showing the previous week's daily arm measurements up at the start of the video. So as you can see, I'm roughly at 17 3/4, just a hair below. So as far as these measurements go, I do them in the morning, fasted, haven't had any food or water. So basically it's just as raw as it can get, obviously no pump or anything like that. So they're basically as accurate as you can get. So we'll see how those trend over time. The topic of today's video is going to be on mesocycles and pre-planning your progressive overload in your training, if there's any benefit to it and what the downsides are, mostly just my overall thoughts on this concept since this is not the way that I train. And as of a couple weeks ago, the Barbell Apparel Adapt joggers officially dropped. I got them luckily before they were officially released. I've been able to wear them for a while at this point. They're awesome. My favorite piece that they've ever dropped for any type of pants or tops or anything. So just to list off some of the perks of these. High quality, durable fabric. It's kind of hard to describe exactly what the material is, but it's almost like sturdy, but it's still stretchy and it's still comfortable. It's a really interesting but kind of cool material. I love it personally. Internal zipper pockets, cargo zipper pockets, tool clip point, which also functions as a knife holder. You got a towel holder, reversible drawstrings, structured waistband. I love to tuck in my shirt, so that comes in super clutch. In Barbell Apparel's overall story about these joggers, we built these joggers to adapt to whatever your training demands. Engineered with a high-quality, abrasion-resistant material, they're tough enough to wear anywhere. With tons of features built from direct feedback by high-level athletes and real-world operators like Navy SEAL Chad Wright, they let you keep everything you need to fuel your training, power, and your adventures, and keep you on the move. What do I think about a method that is a little bit different than mine? Well, the question comes from my previous Q&A. I've been lazy with my Q&As lately anyways, so I figured if there's a good question, I'll take it and film it in a video like this. So the question comes from a guy named Sam. His question is, what are your thoughts on Renaissance periodization style mesocycles? For example, something like a 4-week phase going from 2 RIR to 0 RIR, and then resetting to the weight you did in week 2 and aiming for higher in week 4. I know you said previously you like to train 0 RIR every session, every exercise, and this means if it takes you 3 or 4 sessions to see any progress, that is fine. I definitely suffer from overload anxiety, so I found that using the RP method quote-unquote guarantees I make progress over a mesocycle, but more importantly, it helps manage fatigue buildup. Overall, I do like to train to failure. Too long didn't read, just wondering your opinions on structuring training in RP style mesocycles. So this is basically one of the other big training methods out there. So the way that I go about bodybuilding, as you guys know, just to summarize it the best I can, is use a variation of a dynamic double progression, where the first set is the quote-unquote performance set that I'm looking at, where I track my reps for every set, but for the first set, I'll have a window that I work within. Once my first set surpasses the top end of my rep window that I'm working in, I'll just add weight and I'll keep progressing through that. In contrast to this method, there's the mesocycle method, which is, this guy refers to Renaissance periodization. I'm not sure if they invented it or just kind of popularized this method, but essentially what this method is a planned out period of time. So say 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever amount you decide. And then within that phase, you progress in one or multiple variables. So maybe you slowly add volume over the course of that mesocycle, being the 4, 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever I said. Or maybe you add reps, but it's planned out because you start leaving reps in the tank. So let's say you can get 100 pounds on preacher curls for 10 reps, and at the start of the mesocycle, you start training everything at 4 RIR. So you start at 6 reps. Week 2 or week 3, maybe you go to 7. Week 3 or 4 or 5, you go to 8, etc. By the end of the mesocycle, you are basically hitting your max or above your max, assuming you did add muscle. And then in the example that Sam gave in this question, he's saying you basically overlap your next one. So instead of just starting back at square one, your square one is now, say, week 2 of that first 4-week mesocycle. So you're starting as your quote-unquote square one as what was really step 2 out of 4 steps from the previous training phase. So this is a pretty good way to make sure you're making progress. This works well if you're someone that likes to have a plan put in front of you so you can kind of have an eye on the future, where training in the system that I personally use, it can be a little bit tricky because you're just taking it session by session, really, and you're kind of banking on your own trust in the process and your trust in yourself to be able to add muscle and add reps and add weight over time. Ultimately, it comes down to what your thoughts are and what your opinion is on what causes muscle growth, because at the end of the day, we're here to build muscle, right? So, with my personal philosophy, I like to say that you build muscle just from the stimulus, and progressive overload is an outcome. I've explained this 1,000 times on the channel and in a recent video, so I won't bore you guys with all that information yet again. On the contrary to my philosophy, you have something like, okay, let's flip the chicken and the egg. So if you're somebody like myself that believes that stimulus and just how hard you train and what you do in the gym is what drives muscle growth, and you don't need to make these progression schemes in order to actually cause growth, then training with a stimulus-oriented approach where you prioritize intensity, you prioritize your effort and just your range of motion and all these little things that can make your program and your training as potent as you possibly can for muscle growth. I would just focus on that and let your progressive overload be a reaction to yourself building muscle and something that you are required to keep up with only because it allows you to keep your stimulus. So if you train at 0 reps in reserve and say you're doing 100 pounds on preacher curls for 10 reps, if you're training at 0 reps in reserve and you're building muscle, do you think that's going to be at 10 reps forever? No, it's eventually going to go up to 11 and then 12, and then eventually your reps get too high to where it's not really the most practical window to train in. You can eventually just add weight in exchange for reps, go a little bit heavier because now your muscles have the size to be able to handle that, and you can keep training hard in an appropriate and realistic rep range. If you're of the belief of the contrary of what I just said, and you need to have a progression built into your program in order to cause growth, then you have to leave reps in the tank, you have to leave volume in the tank, you have to train sub-maximally at the start of a given phase, and then it has to be a shorter term phase too, because your growth is going to be long term, and you can't just keep adding a set every couple weeks forever for your 10-year lifting journey or whatever it is, because obviously the math just doesn't equate. Eventually you're going to be doing 500 sets a week on everything, and it just doesn't quite add up. So when you take that second approach, the reason why I'm not a huge fan of this approach, and not that I'm not a huge fan of it, I didn't say that, right? The way I'd want to describe it is there are benefits to it, which I'll touch on at the end of this video, but as far as causing actual muscle growth, the progressions built into that system, I don't believe actually cause any additional growth. Depending on what you can get away with training submaximally, then you might be able to get equal muscle growth, but also avoid more overuse and avoid extra fatigue. Those are kind of the benefits of this approach, but I'd say as far as the actual progressions go, if you're able to add reps and add weight and pre-plan this out because you're training submaximally, while you do get to add weight and add reps and it kind of guarantees progression within your training, you're also not training all out. So I would assume you're more likely to get less stimulus. But at the same time, even if stimulus is equal, training reps in reserve, so say you get the same growth training at 2 or 3 reps in reserve, then 1 rep in reserve, I'd say a lot of this, a little bit off topic, but I think this comes down to the lift more so than it does the individual. Of course, when you talk about individuality within programming, you can take a bunch of factors into account, like the program, how you respond, the exercise selection, all that kind of stuff. But of course, your response to muscle growth and or overuse and fatigue and that kind of stuff is all going to be somewhat individual and somewhat genetic, somewhat based on your overall lifting experience. But to get back to the main point of this question, the main point of this video, I would say built-in progressions aren't necessary because muscle growth happens from stimulus. And an example I like to use that I've talked about before on the channel to hopefully prove my philosophy and prove my point about stimulus causing muscle growth and causing progressive overload rather than progressive overload being required to grow muscle, I would say use the example of my Smith bench. So if I'm week 1 able to do 315 pounds on Smith bench for 7 reps, what am I supposed to do on week 2? So week 1, I trained it to 0 reps in reserve. Maybe I even took it to failure, and I tried a 7th rep, got it halfway up, and just completely failed it. So what am I going to do next week if I'm already at 0 RAR and I have to build in progressions? Well, I can't do 315 for 7 because I already proved to myself that I couldn't do that. So what am I supposed to do? Well, The simple answer is the odds are pretty high I'll actually be able to get 315 for 7 simply because of the stimulus that I got from doing 315 for 6. And that wasn't progressive overload. That was me causing stimulus within my own training to allow myself to do 315 for 7 next week, maybe 315 for 8 next week or in a few weeks down the road. Obviously, it might take a little bit longer for some lifts or for some people, depending on training age and training response. So hopefully that proves my point pretty well. But I would say overall, to kind of answer your question on potential benefits of this mesocycle type programming, I would say there probably aren't any benefits directly to muscle growth. But if you're someone that has a hard time training to zero RIR and training super hard, and you need to kind of experiment with training submaximally, one of the benefits of training within a pre-planned out mesocycle is you get to experiment and figure out what you can get away with as far as training submaximally. So let's say week 1, you leave 2, 3, 4 reps in the tank. Maybe this isn't ideal for growth. Maybe it gets you 80 or 90% of the growth, but it gets you 30% of the fatigue buildup in the overuse injuries, and that lets you recover. And instead of deloading every 4 weeks, you just have a little bit dialed back training where you're still getting some growth. It's not optimal, but you're letting yourself recover. And maybe the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of every mesocycle, until you leave about 2 to 1 reps in reserve, you're actually recovering really well. And that way, when you are training all out to failure to zero RIR, and you're getting that super potent stimulus, which I would argue is probably a thing regardless of what the literature says to this point at least, then you're not spending too long. Maybe it's only 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks training all out like that, and it's not quite enough to give you that fatigue and that overuse and everything. So that's one of the benefits, I'd say. But overall, there's a kind of just my general thoughts off the top of my head of this kind of stuff. I might make more videos on this topic down the road, but either way, if you have any questions on this or the Road to 18 Inch Arms series in general, let me know in the comments. I'll keep them in mind for the next video.